Welcome back to another edition of the Edge podcast. Managing editor Brenden Slaughter, joined as always by recruiting analyst Jared Halus. We're back for another edition of the Edge podcast. The sun is shining, spring out of the way now, getting into summer. Jared, we haven't done a podcast in what feels like forever. How have you been, man? Good to hear from you.
I'm doing great. It's the weather's warming up. It's a little too hot here. We got to about 97 yesterday, so it is certainly warm, but weather's great. Seems like the United States as a whole is kind of coming back together a little bit. So things are going well.
Absolutely. Lots of great sports related things. I mean, obviously right now we've got the NBA playoffs going on and we're seeing fans and crowds and we're seeing, vaccinated sections and we're starting to get there. And I tell you what, nothing's nothing's official yet, but seeing specifically here in Oregon, like the Trailblazers start to have fans, it's a good sign for Oregon State coming towards the fall and winter and, football and basketball, things come together. So lots of things to be positive and optimistic about for sure. Just to kind of kick off the podcast, we haven't really touched base since, the real meat of spring football. Obviously, that's in the rearview mirror now as Jonathan Smith and company wrapped up, if you can believe it, year 4 of spring practice. I almost crazy, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And it was nice to be able to get out and see the team in person. But for you, Jared, after the year that they had, and seeing getting to see kind of everything start to come back together in a sense of normalcy, how much do you think that'll help the team heading into fall camp this year, that they had a normal spring unlike last year?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it will help exponentially. It still kind of blows my mind the strides that I guess that the team was able to make, and just the fact that it didn't really. Obviously, they still got a little piece of fall camp and everything, but it didn't look like. And this was countrywide as well. I mean, it just didn't look like the schools were that unprepared, and that just speaks to the level of athleticism that these guys have.
Right.
So, like you said, I mean, for them being able to get out there again this spring, get a full spring practice in, even get a scrimmage in front of some fans at the stadium, I'm sure they're feeling really good. About to get into summer workouts and a lot of officials as well, which is some huge news that we'll get to later. But definitely a lot of great things happening. I would imagine they're feeling pretty good. Just getting the question back to you.
Yeah.
I would like to hear a lot of the things that you saw, some big takeaways from you. Like you said, you were there in person. Big difference from last year. What did you see that stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, the first takeaway for sure is just how cool it is to be there in person. I mean, I didn't go to every home game this last year by choice. I went to, some of them and chose to sit a couple of them out, mostly because the atmosphere, with lack of better terms, was horrible. It was like trying to play, an NBA arena with an empty arena. It stinks and it's not good. And, you could just tell that it didn't have that same flair. We weren't near the team, weren't connected with the team. You kind of just felt like it was, on top of all that, a lot of other things going on in, our daily lives. So it was a weird year last year, but now moving ahead to spring, we got to be back there in person. We got to, share fist bumps with, people that we used to talk to. Media members got to, break down and go, oh man, wasn't that a great player? Are you seeing the same thing here? And kind of, that real camaraderie aspect, from the media perspective, it was awesome to be back and, feel the tension and, hear the pads pop and, be down there. As far as, the team itself, it's that, I think I said this last spring too, and, we even just very briefly, but it's that this team is just, they're veterans now. They're not a bunch of young guys anymore. You go back to, the early years of Jonathan Smith where they're, breaking guys in just to break guys in. So they'll be, ready to go in a couple years. They've just got some dudes. They've got some leadership. They've got some, 6-year seniors that took advantage of that COVID rule and are going to come back. And, you can't quantify leadership with guys that have been in the program that long. I think of a guy like Trayvon Bradford or a guy like Andre Hughes-Murray who were in college taking classes at Oregon State when I was taking classes at Oregon State. So they've been there a minute. And I think that, that leadership has really been on display throughout spring because they just took care of business, whether it was, communication, better tackling, better approach to certain aspects of practice, tighter in formations, tighter in, kind of how they, attack like goal line situations, red zone situations, excuse me. So they just looked like a team that, wasn't trying to still figure some of it out. And I feel like for a certain extent, whether it was like the first 2 years where it was almost all fundamentals, like every single drill of every single practice. And now we're, moving quite a bit of ways from that. So just the natural growth, seeing guys continue to, get better, seeing, some positions of weakness, or not weakness, but, positions where they were a little thin on depth. Defensive line, secondary, we've talked about it at length. Both those positions look, deeper and better this year. So overall, I thought it was a very successful spring and a lot to be excited about for Beaver fans. And I know those Beaver fans that went to the spring game were a little disappointed. They, didn't get to see more than about 45 minutes worth of action. But as the media members and I joked around the spring game that day, we saw more at practice than they did in that game. And I can tell you there's quantifiable improvement. And I think it would be, I don't think it's out of the question to assume a bowl game this year.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely seems like there was a lot of good things happening. And talking about the spring game, that what's most important when coming out of a spring game is that everybody's healthy.
Yeah.
And of course, you want to put on a good show for your fans. And some schools do take risks to make that happen, like keeping starters in for a quarter or even a half sometimes. I've even seen spring games where the starters play the whole thing, and I'm just like, this is nuts.
Right.
Because all it is a glorified practice. I mean, it's a scrimmage where people are watching. So while yes, of course, you want to give the fans who came out there a good show and some good insight on what the team looks like. What's most important is just that everyone stays healthy. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but if I was a fan, I would much rather see a not so great spring game. In a great season than a fantastic spring game where your best player gets hurt and the season's shot because of it. But I mean, you definitely made some good points there. Is there any? I mean, obviously there was a lot of guys that people were looking forward to hearing about. Was there anyone in particular, player wise, that stood out to you that maybe didn't last year?
It's hard to say didn't last year, but there's, to me, and I wrote about this in one of the recent spring analysis pieces at BeaversEdge, was, and it probably won't surprise you, but it's the guy this spring. And I think it was almost relatively easy to say he was the MVP just of the team. That was Zariah. And,
I knew it.
And, I'm trying not to get like way too excited about him, but, for how long I've been around Oregon State football, there are two receivers in recent memory who have been able to make this much of a jump from year one to year two, and then just look hands and feet better than everyone else in practice. Mm-hmm. That's Isaiah Hodgins and Brandon Cooks. And at times, Zariah this spring was, a man walking amongst boys, where he would just be able to make double coverage catches, beat guys down the field. I mean, he has taken a huge leap from last year. And I don't want to overhype him or anything, but, the coaching staff, basically said he's almost like a veteran out there. The guy is a freshman this year after played in half of a season last year, half of a normal year, and still comes back. So he was a guy that I think would definitely, if Oregon State can get consistent quarterback play, I think he's going to be a really nice piece this year. And also another guy that I know you're going to feel real fondly with, Deshaun Fenwick, South Carolina, running back. He, I was, chit-chatting with some media members, and we were saying like day one or day two, it was really obvious that, you're like, oh yeah, that guy came from the SEC. Like,
so that was a big question that people had. And obviously, I mean, what you're saying and what you've reported is like, can this guy come in and be the starter in year one? And a lot of people have that question. And yes, there's a transition that has to be made. But when you got it, so is that what you're seeing from him?
I think he's going to have a really good shot at taking that. I think BJ Baylor will and should get the first crack at it. I think, being Jamar Jefferson's understudy, being that guy who was always ready to go, lunch pail, hard hat kind of a thing. I think he'll get his opportunity. And, he was the first team back for most of spring, but you could tell Deshaun was starting to, kind of put it all together. And there'd just be times where he's just hitting the hole and you're like, oh, that's kind of like Jamar a little bit. Like it's
say it.
They're
excited.
When we got it, or when we talked about his commitment, we talked about how their games are kind of similar in a few ways. And honestly, when he picks up the playbook, and I think it's going to take, summer will be real good for him. Right. But when he picks up the playbook and enters fall camp, I think there's a really good shot. He could, overtake that starting spot. And just to kind of put a bow tie on spring football before we start talking official visits, if there's an area of concern, and it's slight concern right now, it's the receiving room, only for the fact that it was an incomplete of what we saw. So Zariah was great. Champ Flemings was great. But then the next guy up after that was, Silas Bolden, Trey Pope, Anthony Gould. And, some of the Beavers' big guns, like we didn't see Micaiah Tongue play all spring. That was a guy that I really wanted to see. He wasn't really dressed all spring. So he's a guy who I think is a starting level guy who didn't get a ton of reps. So that there's something in there. Tyjon Lindsey missed time, in and out throughout different times. Trayvon Bradford missed time throughout in and out too. So, I want to see in fall camp. I think fall camp's really important for the receivers because you brought up Deshaun Fenwick, and it immediately reminded me of Micaiah Tongue. Shout out OSU Beef, who has said numerous times on the board he wants to see Micaiah Tongue and Deshaun Fenwick be named, starters. And looking at Micaiah Tongue, just in person, he is probably the biggest receiver Oregon State has, and it's probably not even close. But I want to see him be able to get on the field and, get in there as well, just because right now, that's why we didn't see a real full spring game, was not a lot of numbers at receiver. So I kind of want to see everyone kind of get back from those nagging injuries a little bit. But for the most part, love where the Beavers stand on offense. They need to figure out kind of the quarterback situation. And I think there's, a lot of moving pieces. Going to be a 3 or perhaps even 4-way quarterback battle going into fall camp. So nothing new there. And then defensively, I have to say, defensive line has grown. It's, could still use a piece or two. And Jared and I'll keep hanging on and letting you know what we hear and what we see. But for now, I'm really pleased at where they were from the end of the year 2020 to spring. Many areas I didn't even get a chance to get into on this podcast, but just the improvement is there. Take my word for it. If y'all didn't see what you necessarily wanted to see at that spring game, the improvement is there. This team is hungry and they're motivated. They're done not being at the level they know they should be at. So I think when you combine all those factors, I think it's bowl game or bust, and I got pretty good confidence they'll get 6 wins this year. So,
that kind of brings me to one last question. This really doesn't even have to do with spring ball, but correct me if I'm wrong real quickly. You were saying, aside from Zariah, aside from guys like Sam Flemings, there's kind of a drop afterwards.
I wouldn't say so much. Maybe drop in experience would be probably, because I think the Beavers have some guys. I mean, a guy that, I wrote about just the other day, Silas Bolden, had himself a spring.
Absolutely.
Like, he had himself a spring. I thought Anthony Gould had some good moments as well.
So drop experience is a better way to put it.
Yeah, just because like Trayvon Bradford, he's just a winning football player you're going to want to have on the field, right? Mm-hmm. Micaiah Tongue is, at least looking at him, a mismatch nightmare for a lot of defensive backs in this conference. My point in all that is there's a lot of bodies at wide receiver, and I wrote about that earlier this week. Like, 6, 7, or maybe 8 guys I think are all kind of in the same relative kind of pool. And, kind of like last year, I think it could be hard to, feed that many mouths just because I know there's talent there, but there's still one ball. And we saw this last year. The passing game never really got started,
So does it surprise you then, just to get to the question? I mean, you say there's a lot of bodies, maybe not as much experience to show for it. Does Irish's move, does that speak to the
Depth? Oh, without question.
quality of the guys at receiver, or the need for bodies in the secondary?
I think probably the former, just because I don't think there's a dying need for bodies in the secondary now. And I think you and I have kind of been able to see that with numbers. But as far as like Irish, obviously, reported by Nick Daschle, the Oregonian, first, that he's going to be moving over to defensive back. And I think that's more along the lines of like a guy like Silas Bolden popped this spring and was like, whoa, okay, this guy is, capable. I think Anthony Gould I just think maybe, as for why it was Irish, I couldn't necessarily say, but as far as like needing depth at secondary, I don't think so. I just think there's a lot of talent. There's a ton of talent at receiver. Coach Lindgren said, we feel confident going like 7 or 8 deep. There aren't very many teams that trot out that many receivers. So it's really going to be interesting overall. But, for the most part, I am very pleased. Like after, I've watched this team now under Smith spring by spring by spring. And this was by far the first spring that I can remember where it just seems like this is the way that it's supposed to be. Like, the Beavers know what their mission is to make a bowl game now. They felt like they should have done it 2 years ago. Right. And, I mean, you can see it in their eyes. That's all that matters, is getting back to the postseason. And that's what's got me so excited about the team after spring, and obviously leading into fall camp when that kicks off in August.
There's some other things to be excited about too, that are a little bit closer around the corner, like only, I guess, a week away now, huh?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, Beavers are making up for lost time with the month of June, especially with, Jared, just putting on our recruiting hats here. As I see, you already got a nice hat on. So yeah, put on that recruiting hat here. It has been how long since Oregon State's had an official visitor on campus?
It would have to be the season of 2019.
So we're talking 400 and some days, no, 400 or 500 days and counting now. Long time.
Yeah, it's a long time.
Yeah, and Oregon State's loaded up in June. They've got 3 weekends of official visits in June. Jared, tell us what we need to know about those official visits. Beavers leaving no stone unturned. They even got some high-profile guys coming to Corvallis too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the first thing to point out, and this has definitely been something that's been widely discussed now on the damn board, is just, like you said, the amount of bodies that are coming in, making up for lost time. And it all happened really fast. Things got lifted, the regulations got lifted finally after countless extensions. And it was pretty quick. People started locking in their official visits. Now, whether that speaks to the excitement that these guys have to see Corvallis, or the staff's ability to get those guys into town, I don't think it really matters, because either way they're going to be there. And if there's one thing that we did learn about Coach Jonathan Smith and the staff around him from when the visits were allowed, is that they know how to host an official visit.
They do.
Because I can't remember the amount of times. It was my first year on the site. I came in, I think, in April. So I was right there before the visits were about to start. Next thing you know, I see a guy coming in that's got 15 offers from schools, and then Zariah Beeson, a high-profile former 4-star receiver from Texas, come in. And obviously he's got countless offers as well. I think he had an offer from LSU, who went on to win the national championship that year. Both those guys come in, commit the next week. I'm like, okay, wait a second. And then that just continued on throughout the summer. Yeah. So again, it doesn't matter why it's happening the way it is, but what does matter is that they're going to be there. And like you said, they've got a really great group of guys coming in. We can dive into that first week in more detail if you'd like. Speaking of Texas receivers and Texas people overall, if there's a school you want to target, Duncanville's up there. And they've got 2 guys.
They got a pretty good receiver already from there, right? He's okay. Yeah. He's okay.
You were just talking about him. So, I mean, having Jarrell Powers come in and having Quincy Wright come in, the defensive lineman, which, as you said earlier, is definitely something that people are wanting to see. I mean, you couldn't ask for a much better first weekend. So I think it's going to be super exciting to see those guys come into town and see if anything comes of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned Quincy Wright. How much How much would it do for Oregon State and specifically Jonathan Smith to be able to land a marquee freshman defensive tackle? Not a defensive end, but I'm talking a marquee plug, 3-4 defense. You are the nose tackle. How, when I look at someone, like Quincy Wright, definitely someone who's kind of, fits that mold a little bit. So I'm like, how much do you think that would be if, like, there's a couple guys, and, we'll get into it in future podcasts and whatnot. The Beavers are having some defensive linemen come through. And I'm, my question to you is, how much would that kind of grease the wheels? That's probably number one question we get here at Beavers Edge is, what are the Beavers doing with their defensive line? Mm-hmm. So how much would that grease the wheels to maybe get one or two, like, bigger defensive tackles that are freshmen?
Yeah, I mean, for one, it would create experience for the long term. You talk about having those guys come in who could be a marquee freshman, where they know they're the guy. That's a huge deal, because it doesn't mean you're going to be good this year. It means you're going to be good for the next 4 years.
Exactly.
Especially on the defensive line. So we've seen them really kind of plug the gaps as needed, taking the JUCO route, taking the transfer portal route. Yeah. But getting in a guy from high school as a freshman who you're competing with all these other schools for would be, it would be huge. And I mean, whether it's Wright or whether it's someone else, it's going to happen. So just stay tuned. It's going to be super exciting. Hopefully it's Wright, because that would be super quick. And if they can continue building that Texas pipeline, I mean, there's no telling what could happen in the future. But just the fact that they're able to get both of those guys in there already, Zariah Beeson's blowing up their phone as well. It's definitely a good sign for the future.
Last question I kind of just have for you as we kind of look into that first, June as a whole.
Yeah.
How key is it? And I say key here, and maybe actually how much careful planning. I've noticed Oregon State has at least one committed player every weekend. So what does that do for a guy coming in going, hey, yo, I'm already coming here. This pretty good deal we got going. Like, how much can that, and, guys talking again and being able to do things and experience campus, and, we see it at the highest level of sports all the time. Guys want to go play with their friends. Why does LeBron James have Anthony Davis in LA? Why, so on and so forth. That's sports. Why does Tom Brady have some of his friends in Tampa Bay now? It all goes hand in hand. And my question to you is, how impactful do you think that can be? There's at least one guy that's already been like, this is where I'm going in every single visit weekend.
Yeah, super, super impactful. Like you said, it's not really a coincidence. You bring those guys there for a reason. And if someone else can hear from somebody else who's going through the same thing they're going through, say, I chose here over these places because of this, especially a guy like Melvin Jordan, top 50 player in the country. I mean, from my neck of the woods, the guy's traveling across the world to go to the school. So having a guy like him in there, and allowing people to hear the things that he has to say, and it's not even necessarily that they don't already know it, because we've said this a million times. If you ask a recruit what they like about Oregon State, they'll say the coaches that quickly.
Yeah.
So it's not that they don't already know that the staff's showing a lot of love, but when other people their age and who have similar interests and obviously play the same sports as them have bought into it, and they can build a connection with those guys while they're in town, it definitely plays a huge impact. And like you said, it's going to happen every week. You hear it countless times where, whether it's through former high school teammates or they have family member who previously went to the school. Usually those are the guys that you get. So it's really important to have those connections built for sure.
Certainly. And again, you're going to want to keep it locked to BeaversEdge.com for basically the entire month of June, because that is Jared and I's focus at this point is, obviously, the baseball team wrapping up, their season and getting ready for whatever postseason and wherever their destination is going to land. But June's a big month for the Oregon State football team. 3 big weekends. And, we've talked about it on the board, talked about it in mailbags, any number of things. This seems like where Oregon State could just start to get commitments in rapid fire and over the course. So again, keep it locked to BeaversEdge.com. It's going to be the place to be. that'll go ahead and wrap it up for this edition of the Edge podcast. Make sure to stay tuned as Jared and I will be breaking down and previewing all the visitors, all the commitments, everything that comes out of, the Beavers hosting a whole bunch of guys over the course of June, which is just awesome. And, really is a positive thing that, kind of helps us all think that things are getting a little bit closer back to normal. Also broke down spring football as well. So for Jared Halus and Brenden Slaughter, this will be signing off from this edition of the podcast. We'll be back, try to be back a little bit more consistently now. Maybe, took a little bit off as Jared and I had a busy spring, but try to be back almost semi-weekly again because I miss talking to you, Jared.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always fun. It's always fun for sure. And hopefully there will be a lot to talk about.
Yeah, hopefully some commitments and lots of recruiting scoops. So again, for those recruiting gurus out there, this is your time of the year. It's coming up and it's going to be exciting. BeaversEdge.com is going to be the place to be. Go ahead and keep it locked. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Edge podcast.